Hey everybody, this is Brian with Red Dirt Cryptid Investigations. First of all, I'd like to thank you for being here and coming to hang out with us. I appreciate you guys being here. Well, I got something different for you tonight. A couple of months ago, I had a fella that I'm going to call Tex who reached out to me via email. Now, he lives overseas, but he grew up on the Salt Fork River in between Lamont and Tonkawa, Oklahoma. And he grew up there, I guess you could say during the 70s. And he had a series of stories to tell me. Very interesting. And I looked forward very much to receiving his emails. And for the most part, we're still in contact. But I thought I would take some time and tell you his story. Now, Tex's family lived in a house on a farm that his dad actually grew up in. And they were just right there next to the river. And, of course, there's all these woods around there. And Tex ended up having some encounters that he was going to share with us. But the first encounter that he's going to share with us is actually something that happened to his uncle at that location when he was a kid. This probably happened in the 40s. So I'm going to read you the story, just like he sent it to me. Now, I did make a few minor corrections, but for the most part, this is exactly what he wrote. First, I'll start with my uncle's story about a monster that he encountered when he was probably about 10 years old. I remember him telling this story one time at Christmas when I was pretty young. I was probably about 10 years old myself, and I remember how the rest of the relatives laughed and said things like, "Oh, you're not going to tell that story again, are you?" And generally they dismissed him. But even as a child, I could see that he was red-faced angry and adamant that his story was true. I actually felt sorry for him for being ridiculed like that. Now, I am not exactly certain where this took place, but I believe that it happened at the same farmhouse that I grew up in because this uncle was one of my dad's older brothers, and they all lived there when they were kids, 6 boys and 1 girl. And it would have been, they would have had an outhouse back then. The outhouse was still there whenever I was a kid growing up, but we had indoor plumbing by then. But the old outhouse was still standing, and when I was a kid, it was a source of great curiosity to me. Anyway, my uncle said that one cold winter night when he was about 10 years old, he had to go out for a poop. And he hurried out into the dark, and he ran out there in bare feet into the outhouse. I think he even mentioned that there was snow on the ground, but I'm not exactly sure. Anyway, he said that he was half asleep, and when he came around the side of the outhouse and he tried to push the door open, it was like there was something that was preventing the door from coming open. He pushed harder and probably, he was probably in a hurry to take a crap, He said that when he finally struggled his way in, he ran face first into a wall of stinking hair. And he said that he looked up and he saw that it was a monster. And he said that when he screamed, he said that it screamed too. And they both ran in opposite directions, him running back to the house as fast as he could, and the monster was legging it across the field. Now, that uncle was one of my dad's older brothers, and they grew up in that same place. And I guess it would be probably about the 1940s or so. My dad was off doing military stuff in the 50s, so that's a rough guess. All of my relatives pretty much stayed in that area, and they grew up and they farmed in that area there. I remember hearing this story and seeing my grandma laughing and saying that, yeah, she remembered him running back into the house scared as hell and crying. I guess they couldn't bring themselves to believe that he'd actually seen a really big hairy monster back then. That was decades before the Patterson-Gimlin film ever even happened, so there wasn't any knowledge about such things. I remember my uncle was absolutely steadfast, even as a grown man, that it was true. And he was angry, even after all those years, that they were still making fun of him about it. He was serious, I could tell, and I'm glad that I got to hear his story, because it made some of the things that happened to me later seem not so insane. Also, there was another side story that I probably need to mention. I remember as a kid overhearing my uncle and my dad and another uncle one day talking about something that had killed a hog and ran off with it. I was probably about 9 or 10 years old at the time, so you're probably talking about the late 60s or early 70s. I remember standing in the hog pen looking at a broken fence, and my uncle was saying something like, "And I seen that son of a bitch carrying that hog under its arm, and it just pushed the fence down and with its other hand and stepped over and then ran off down the hill." All right, here we go. Right over here is where your house was. You can see they got a lot of irrigation wells here. And I bet that tree was there when you were growing up. This is the road that you were talking about. And I don't normally trespass, but this part's not even posted. It's definitely windy. You can make you glad you're not home anymore. It's very sandy. There's a little hill right there. And back in the back, that's where your timber was. Back in there. Man. Yeah. This would have been your front yard right here. Right in here. I don't know what the place looked like. As you can see, there's a lot of cover right now. Wow. Things change. Next, I'm going to tell you about some of the Dogman encounters that he wrote about. Here we go. Back then, nobody had ever heard about Bigfoot or Dogman, so the only thing that they had to compare it to was a coyote, because they were common around here. But they were really freaked out that it was standing upright and watching them as the car went by. I was one of 3 kids. I'm the oldest. And when my little brother was about 5 years old, we had bunk beds. I was on the top one. And one night, I was woken up by my little brother's terrified screaming about a werewolf looking in the window beside our bed. It was so startling that I nearly fell off the top bunk, and my mom and my dad came rushing into the room. My dad went outside with a flashlight, and I remember watching him from my spot on the top bunk as he looked around outside of our window. There was a lot of grown-up mumbling and talking, and the next day, he welded up a metal bar grate to bolt over the window by our bunk bed. He wouldn't have done that if he thought it was all just a bad dream. I suspected that he knew something, but he wasn't saying. My dad had been some kind of sergeant in the National Guards at some point, and he looked almost exactly like Sergeant Carter. You know, the one that used to shout at Gomer Pyle all the time on the TV show when I was a kid. My dad was fairly stocky and fairly hard guy that wasn't afraid of nothing. But he was very weary about going down to the woods behind our farmhouse. My dad didn't hunt, fish, or ever go camping or anything like that. In the later years, I found that a little bit strange, since almost everybody around there and all of us kids loved that kind of stuff. But my dad had grown up right there in the same house and he was absolutely not the outdoors type, even if I was. But a really weird thing is that any time he had to go down to the timber to fix a fence or anything, he would always strap on a 1911 Model 45 Auto. Now, I hunted all the time as a kid, but my dad never did, not ever. I don't think that I ever saw him fire any more than 5 rounds the entire time I was growing up. And even when it was only to show me, even then, it was only to show me how the guns worked. He never carried anything with him anywhere he went apart from when he had to go down to the woods out back. And that was weird. As far as I knew, back there wasn't anything in those woods that I would ever need a 45 for. And so it was really strange that my dad always carried it, even to go to the woods just for farm work. He absolutely always had a gun with him when he went there, and not any other time whatsoever. Just in the woods at our farm. Now, I remember him explaining to me that a 45 bullet was meant to hit hard and knock people backwards. He told me if I ever need to shoot at anything with this 45, I was to aim right in the middle of its chest and to take double shots to make sure I got a good hit. It was like how the Army told you to do it in battle situations. I found all this a little bit strange, and to myself I thought, why in the hell would I ever need to shoot anything with a 45? I had much more suitable guns for anything that I would ever be hunting for. The fact that he never went into the woods without it, and that he absolutely did not hunt or fish like most people around there, did make me wonder if he knew something and he wasn't saying. Now, the last story that Tex had for his Dogman Encounters was a story that actually happened to his mother and his aunt. Apparently, they were driving home, and they saw what they described as a giant coyote standing up on its back legs in the wheat field right beside the house. It scared them pretty bad. They came inside the house, and they were talking about it, and they were pretty rattled. Tex also shared this secondhand story. He says, on a side note, there was an older boy whose family lived down the road from us when I was a teenager, and it was always said that he had shot and killed a huge timber wolf or a Canadian wolf somewhere on the property by our farm. His name was Larry Blank, and the last I heard decades ago, he was living in blank blank city. But I had never really known him personally very well, and so I don't really know the story. It was just a weird thing that I was told back then. I remember one of the kids at school claimed that he had seen the dead body in the back of a pickup truck at the co-op in Lamont. And he said that it was no wolf, it was a wolf man. I didn't know how to take such a story as that, and of course school kids do like to tell tales. Who knows whether it was a wolf man that was seen in the back of the pickup at the Lamont co-op in the 1960s. But the whole story always seemed weird because I never heard of another Canadian wolf sighting anywhere around there. Those kind of wolves don't just go wandering around all the way down in Oklahoma. So I've always wondered what was really up with that. Here is the northeast corner of the property. And as you can see, it's a little windy. Looks like water drops from here. This is a low spot. Back in the back, you can kind of see there's all that scrub brush stuff. That sandy area maybe you're talking about. There's a Zimmatic, and there's your woods, your timber, as you called it. Right there, and right over there where that dust is blowing, that's where your house was. Let me go drive up there. Dang, the wind is really blowing today. This email I'm going to call The Peaker. He said, well, on this one particular summer's day, I had gone down to the water tank on my mini bike and I had left it by the tank while the water was filling up. And I wandered off and discovered an old cellar that I did not know about previously. If you know about how Oklahoma farmhouses are, you'll be familiar with the below-ground cement cellars that were common back then. Our farmhouse had one right out back. It's where you went to hide when the tornadoes came. Anyway, I found an old cellar down in the woods that, of course, had no door left on it or anything because it was so old and neglected. And being a curious kid, I went up and peered down into its depths to see what was there. It must have been the last remnants of a long-gone homestead. Anyway, this old cellar looked to be about half filled with old leaves and tree branches and all kinds of crap, and right at the back against the wall, it looked like it had some kind of large nest area. I stood there peering down into the cellar, and it took my eyes a little while to get used to the dark because it was a bright summer day and it was very dark down in the cellar. But after a few moments, I could actually see what looked like the nest in the back. It looked like a sleeping area or something similar at the back of the wall of the vault. I found this quite curious, and I wondered what in the hell could have been using that old cellar to sleep in. We didn't have any bears around there, and most everything else that I knew of did their own things. Coyotes and badgers made their own holes, and skunks and coons and stuff like that. They did their own thing. This was actually, it looked like something bigger had been using the cellar as its home. As I was stooping over, peering into that abyss, I got a really creepy feeling, probably because I was wondering about what was sleeping in there. I stood up and I looked around suspiciously. Then, about 30 yards away, I saw a slight, odd movement on the side of a tree. It wasn't a particularly big tree. I'd say it was only big enough that I could put my arms around it. But it looked like there was something furry clinging to the side of the tree, about 4 or 5 feet up, but I couldn't make out what it was. My first impression that it was a skunk, because it was kind of hairy, like a skunk's tail. It's kind of bushy. But I thought it would have been highly unlikely for a skunk to be climbing 5 foot up a tree trunk. So I strained my eyes to get a better look, and that's when I saw more hair sticking out of the other side of the tree, about 4 or 5 feet up too. I couldn't figure it out, and I think I was probably took a couple of steps closer to get a better look. Remember, I had just been peering down in a dark hole, so my eyes were not adjusted right to the bright daylight. After squinting at it a bit, I could make out an eyeball and half of a face poking out from the side of the tree, seemingly staring at me. I was absolutely bewildered and wondered if it was the face of a cow or something, and I moved a step or so to my right to get a better look and see around the trunk better. But to my astonishment, the face retreated back around the tree the same amount. It looked like it was trying to hide from me, but it was too big to fit behind the tree. I could not figure out what in the hell I was seeing, so I took a step to the side in the opposite direction and tried to look around the tree trunk better. And when I did that, it also moved again, keeping the tree trunk between me and it. I did this stupid little sideways dance a few times, craning my head one way or the other before I finally caught a better look of the thing. And I'll be damned, it looked like a caveman. It wasn't massive. It only stood about the same height as me, 5-ish feet or so. And it wasn't very bulky. In fact, it looked a little lanky with long, skinny arms and legs. It was covered with black hair, and the hair wasn't thick, like a dog's hair. It was sort of sparse enough that you could see dark leathery skin beneath it. The hair was maybe 3 or 4 inches long, and there was no hair on its face. It did not seem to have, it did seem to have sort of a neck beard, but no signs of a proper mustache or beard. The hair on its head was only marginally longer than it was on its forearms. Because of the weeds, I couldn't see below its knees. But I didn't really care about that anyway, because I was suddenly thinking that there was a caveman in these woods, and it was looking at me. It was sort of flat-faced, with a larger jaw than a human would have, and I don't recall what the ears looked like, but it had a flattish nose, but not like a gorilla. It's hard to explain, but sometime later I happened upon an illustration in the National Geographic magazine that looked almost exactly like what I had seen, and it absolutely astonished me. If you look up Australopithecus, that's a pretty fair example, except that almost all the Australopithecus illustrations have monkey noses, and the thing that I saw had a different nose. It was a much more human-looking nose, but not quite. Well, anyway, that frightened the shit out of me, and I wanted to get out of there. But on the farm, we'd always been taught not to run away from animals because they might instinctively chase you. So I just turned around and fast-walked back to the water tank, which probably took a couple of minutes. I was certain that I could hear this damn thing following me, but that could have just been my fear taking over. As I passed by the water tank, I slapped the faucet handle down on the fly, and I quickly pull-started my mini bike engine, and as fast as I could, I tore out of there at breakneck speed of probably 15 or 20 miles an hour over rough ground to get back to the road. I'm telling you, that was torture. I just knew that at any moment that caveman was going to chase me down and do unspeakable, vile things. But as it turns out, nothing of the sort happened, and I made it home without dying. This next part, he says, takes place 1 year later. He says, I have to say that the frightening encounter that I had that time down by the old cellar in the woods affected me greatly, and I kept trying to tell myself that it must have been something else besides what I thought it was. But no matter what I ran through my head trying to explain the matter, I could never really shake the notion that what I had seen was not something as mundane as a cow or anything so obvious. I got a damn good look at it, and the way it kept retreating around the tree trunk, seemingly trying to hide from me, was just not the way cows or deers or any other creature you might encounter out there would act. I certainly didn't want to believe that I'd actually seen a hairy hominid in the woods, but at the same time, I could find no other explanation. And back then, you certainly didn't talk about this kind of stuff with other people, out of fear that you would be literally ridiculed to death and never be able to show your face in public again. And that uncomfortable predicament kept staying on my mind a lot, and I went about my usual chores and general doings around the farm at the time. It didn't make me stop going down to the woods, but I avoided that particular area where I'd found the old cellar. I still went fishing down at the river and often walked past the cattle watering tank, which gave me an idea. Some of the catfish that I often caught in the river were just a tad bit too small to really bother with trying to eat, but I figured that maybe if I took them and put them in the water tank, that they might grow, and then I'd be able to eat them at a future time. I was only a youngster, and the idea seemed very logical at the time. The cattle water tank had a pretty healthy ecosystem in it already, with a mud bottom and snails and water plants and bugs, and sometimes there was even tadpoles and all sorts of things thriving in it, so I figured a few catfish would certainly be fine in there with everything else. So over the next few months or so, I would occasionally deposit small catfish that I caught at the river into the tank. They seemed to do pretty fine in there, and I liked checking on them whenever I had to go down to top off the tank, which was always slightly uncomfortable chore for me due to the caveman encounter that I had. But months went on and didn't see anything, and it got easier for me to just dismiss this encounter as a mistaken identity or something. I just tried to put it out of my head. So one day I had gone down on my mini bike to do the usual chore of topping off the water tank when I pulled up to the tank and I found that it was surrounded by wet mud. I found all of this a little bit odd, and upon approaching the tank, I could see that the water was all churned up into a completely impenetrable, muddy mess. It was even still sort of sloshing around like it had been recently disturbed. I looked around, but I could see no cattle anywhere, and the sides of the water tank were a little bit too tall for cows to be jumping over just to stand in the water tank. Usually if the cattle felt like standing in something cool, they would go over to the drainage ditch in the field because there was always standing water there. Like I said before, I often used to hunt bullfrogs in it, so you know it was a pretty stable environment. Anyway, I was standing there looking at the muddy mess and wondering if or why any of our cows would have done this, and I was actually kind of pissed about the catfish in the tank. I didn't know if they were okay or even if they were still in there or what. Anyway, I lifted the handle on the water faucet and began topping off the tank, and as I was standing there scrutinizing the situation, I began to see what looked like footprints all over in the fresh mud around the tank. The more I looked, the more I started to see. These were not the markings of cows or anything else I knew of. They actually looked like big human footprints, and I was wondering how some weirdo had trekked up all the way up into the middle of this farmland to go swimming in our water tank when there was a perfectly good and easily accessible river nearby, which was such an absurd and unlikely scenario that it didn't even bear thinking about. But of course, by now, you've started to figure out where this story is going. As I was standing there with the water running, I was looking around in the general area in a perplexed mode, and I happened to see something in the dark shade underneath the tree about 50 yards away to the west of the water tank. At first, I thought it might be one of those damned cows that had stupidly churned up the water, but it didn't look quite right, and I was trying to squint to get a better look into the dim shade. There, I distinctly saw a pair of eyes do a sideways glance and back, and they did not look like cow eyes. In hindsight, I would actually say they looked like gorilla's eyes. What I could make out was a figure standing there in the shade next to a big tree. I could see that it was hairy, and it appeared to be human-shaped. I immediately thought of that damn caveman that I had seen in the same general area previously. It was about the same lanky build and about the same height, and maybe 5'5" or so. And of course, I was immediately scared to death. This is one of those ice-cold oh shit moments when your eyes bug out and your jaw drops. I slapped the water handle down and I pull-started my mini bike, and I bugged out as fast as I could, just like last time. It would have been a funny thing to watch, I'm sure, but at the time, I was dead frightened. My thoughts were that this bastard had been stealing my catfish out of the tank just prior to me pulling up there, and thinking about it now as an adult, I would say this thing probably could have heard me approaching on my mini bike for several minutes. So if it was indeed stealing my catfish out of the tank, it could have heard me coming and got away before I got there. I believe this is what it did, and I believe that this thing had probably seen me at other times, so it knew exactly what I was going to do. Maybe it was just hoping that I would top the water tank off and go away. I don't know. But at that point, that was my second encounter, and it made me believe that absolutely, yes, there was something hanging around in those woods. It changed my life. I could no longer try to explain this away. I was now absolutely convinced that something unusual was up, but at that time, I didn't know what. I was probably about 14 years old or so when I saw a very strange sight while driving a tractor in the field behind our farmhouse. I remember the corner end of the field was a fairly sandy patch, and it wasn't good for growing wheat, but it was good for growing watermelons. Looking at a modern map, it appears that it's still like that, so not much has changed. Anyway, I glanced up and I saw at the end of the field in front of me what looked like two black monkeys chasing each other in a playful manner. It's kind of like when you see two dogs playing and they chase each other around with their tail between their legs, sort of scurrying as opposed to all out running, if you see what I mean. They looked to be about as big as a coyote, and at first that's what I thought they were, but they were shaped all wrong. They seemed to have really longer front legs or arms, and they were absolutely solid black. When I first saw them, they were going really fast in the short grass at the edge of the brush at the edge of the field. It seemed like they were playing or something. They appeared to be going on all four legs like a dog, and they sort of reminded me about the way you see chimps chasing after each other on TV or in the zoo or something. I only saw them for a moment, and then I had to turn my head around to look what I was doing with the tractor and the hydraulics. When I looked back up again, still perplexed as to what these things were, they had stopped dead, and both of them were facing to the right. They were maybe 4 or 5 feet apart, just sitting there dead still now. My eyes followed over to the right a little ways, and to my astonishment, there was a massive black figure just standing there upright like a human, just at the edge of the brush, seemingly looking at these two monkeys, or whatever they were, from maybe 20 yards away. It sort of looked like the two little things had been caught doing something that they shouldn't have been doing and were getting scolded by the big one or something. It's kind of hard to explain. The big standing figure was also absolutely solid black, and it looked like somebody wearing a black football uniform. The shoulders were huge, like the shoulder pads that they wear, and the head looked like it had a helmet stuck on top with no visible neck. The arms were much longer and bulkier than a human's arms would have been, and it had to have been a person. Even if it had been a person in a football outfit. The legs were stocky and bulky, and again, looking a lot like the way football players look when all kitted out. The whole thing was completely black. I was absolutely dumbfounded. I was thinking, this was a hunter or something with some dogs? Or is this some kind of strange person dressed up like a football player hanging around the ass end of our field for no reason? I couldn't figure it out, and I only had maybe 10 seconds to look at it when I had to turn my head around again to deal with the tractor. And when I was able to look back again, the two little ones were just disappearing through the bushes. I literally watched their asses disappear into the leaves. And the big one that had been standing there was already turning away from my direction, and it looked like it just took 2 quick steps and disappeared into the bush. When I got to the end of the field where they were, I stopped the tractor where I had seen them, and I just sat there with the engine running, looking all around to try to make sense of what I'd just seen. I was too frightened to actually get off the tractor, and I probably sat there for 3 or 4 minutes just looking at everything before going back to what I was doing. But for the rest of the day, I kept an eye on that location. I never saw anything more, but the scene was burned into my memory, and I always just kept playing it back over and over and over again in my mind, trying to figure out what in the hell I'd seen. This was before I had become aware of the Patterson-Gimlin film, and I had never even heard of a Bigfoot or Dogman. So I just had no idea what this was all about. When I was about 16, my parents moved back to Tonkawa, about 10 miles away from our old farmhouse. I think by then the farm had been sold off, maybe to other family or something. I don't really know all the details, but it was hard times for farmers around there back then, and I think my parents just decided they couldn't keep doing it, and they chucked it in, and they moved to town. They had jobs as teachers, so the whole farm thing was just sort of petered out, and by the time we'd moved back to Tonkawa, the old farmhouse had stood empty and derelict for a few years. I didn't get on with living in town in Tonkawa, and I didn't like the school, and at some point I quit school in my senior year, and I started working certain jobs, and pretty soon I had moved into the old farmhouse back in the country. It had a propane tank that I couldn't afford to fill up, so I used an old wood stove that I got somewhere for heat, and although there was usually some electricity, it regularly went off for days at a time, and I often had to make do with oil lamps, so it was pretty primitive going at times, but I was trying to make the best of a crappy situation. I didn't have a dog around this time, and one night when I was just chilling out by the wood stove in the darkened room, I heard a barking from out front in the road. It was big barking, not like dogs or coyotes that I had heard before. This was quite ominous sounding, and it spooked me. It sounded like some enormous angry dog was out in the road in front of the house, being aggressive towards me, barking and growling in a menacing way. I got up and I looked out the front door, but it was too dark to see anything. Whatever it was right out there in front in the dirt road in front of the house, making a lot of very scary noises. It sounded like it was pacing back and forth in the road out in front of the house, being very aggressive and obviously right at me. Well, that spooked me, and I got my .30-06. And I went out on the front porch to see what the hell was going on. Man, this thing sounded big. Its voice was loud and deep, and sometimes it made noises like yar, 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 like it was trying to talk or something between vicious barks. Scared the crap out of me. I couldn't see it in the dark, but I could tell where it was in the road, probably 40 yards away by the sounds of it, and it was making all this noise, and this thing sounded like it was yelping at me from way up high above the level of the road, where no dog could be that tall. I grew up on that farm, and I have a perfect mental picture of the front yard and the road, and this thing sounded like it was about 7 feet tall and extremely big and heavy. I could hear its feet as it moved around, barking at me. So there I was, scared as hell with this monster yapping at me, and I took good aim at where I figured it to be, probably in the middle of its body, and I popped off a shot at it in the dark. I don't know if I hit it or if the sound of the gun frightened it, but I heard it yipe, and it ran away down the road towards the south, towards the old Cadle place. It sounded like it was running down the road on 2 legs. I was scared to death. I stayed up for the rest of the night indoors by the big front window with my rifle until it was light enough for me to feel safe enough to get to my car and get out of there. I spent the next few nights in town, in Tonkawa, with my parents at their house, but eventually I just had to go back home because that's where I felt best. And for a while, things seemed okay. Anyway, after I'd settled down to do a few more routine existence for a while, maybe several months or so with nothing weird going on, I was woken up one night in the middle of the night. It was just one of those situations where you don't know what woke you up, but you suddenly sit straight up and you know something's up. And as I was sitting there in the dark wondering what was going on, I saw a huge shadow pass right by the west-facing bedroom window. It was moonlit outside, and I saw the form of a huge man-like figure pass right by the window, only it was way bigger than any man. It was massive. I could only see it in silhouette against the moonlight sky, but I remember it looked like it was covered in fur or hair, and it only took one step to pass completely by my window. And 2 seconds later, it passed by the other window in the room on the north wall. It looked like it was going around the corner of the bedroom towards the front of the house. It scared the shit out of me, and I grabbed my rifle and I scuttled on my hands and knees into the darkened front room where the huge picture window was. I didn't have curtains on the front window, so it had a full view of the whole front yard, and whatever it was that had passed by the window was probably going to come around the side of the house into view. So I just cowered there, peeking over the bottom of the big window with my rifle, waiting to see what was going to emerge. And I figured that whatever it was, human or otherwise, I'd at least have a good clear shot at it. But nothing happened. That freaked me out even more. I was sure that whatever it was surely going to come around the side of the house, and I'd have the opportunity to possibly pop a few rounds of my army surplus into it if I had to. But nothing appeared, and that made me even more frightened. I wondered if whatever it was knew I was there, and that this was going to become some kind of stalking situation. So I crouched down there in the dark, scared to death, watching out the window. I kept thinking about all the weird stuff that's been going on around there ever since I was a kid, and I especially remember that incident when I was a kid where my dad had gone outside with the shotgun and yelled at something on the roof. I was terrified to be there anymore. That was one long night, I can tell you, and it was the last night that I ever spent in that house. Well, I would like to thank Tex for reaching out to me in the first place and sharing his encounters with us. It's good that we know what went on back there, back in the 70s, and even that story from his uncle in the 40s. You know, without people reaching out and sharing what they know, stories like this could be lost forever. So I'd encourage everyone to reach out just like Tex did and give me your story. Now, one thing that I did find funny, and he did mention in his emails, he said he wondered if there was still any activity around there in that area. And I happened to be up on Highway 60, and I saw this. What's the chances that just a few miles up the road from where Tex grew up, that there would be a house on the side of the highway with a Sasquatch cutout? I don't know. Maybe they are still there.